Okay, thank you very much to all of you to be here. Thank you very much on behalf of the PhD program on communication and design at the University of Vic, Central University of Catalonia, and the Spring Network. I'm Xavier Ginesta. I'm the director of the Department of Communication Sciences at the University of Vic, Central University of Catalonia. And we are very happy to have a fantastic webinar today with such amount of experts on sport washing and sport communication. Today, we're going to launch a new book based on the coordination of Professor Xavier Ramon and Professor Peter English, but we also will have some of their main contributors in this volume, which I'm very happy because I'm sure that you are going to give fantastic insights about how we have to interpret and how we have to work with this field, which is quite new, but it's very theoretically muscular, which is sports washing. So thank you very much, Xavier, to be here at the University of Vic, and Xavier, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I will now share our presentation. So thank you very much for the opportunity of participating in the third research seminar hosted by the Spring Network and the Faculty of Communication Sciences at the University of Vic, Central University of Catalonia. Thanks to our colleagues Xavier Ginesta, Nahuel Faedo, and Abardie for organizing this event, and to all the members of the audience for being here today. In this seminar, Peter and I will present our book, which is Sports Washing, Global Perspectives on the Politics of Promotion, which is part of the Palgrave Macmillan Pivot series. The book breaks new ground in sports media research by looking at this new phenomenon of sports washing at a time when it is increasingly pervasive in these commercial elements of elite sport. The project presents a range of perspectives and case studies from 14 scholars across the globe who are members of the IMCR Media, Communication and Sport section and the ECREA Communication and Sport Temporary Working Group. So this is our lineup. This is our amazing lineup. Our contributors are David Rowe, Christoph Seeger, Jörg Nielan, Kirsten Franzen, Luke Bird, Tony Bruce, Christopher Tulloch, Alice Nemkova Tepkaloga, Mohamed Al-Ghamdi, Damian Sturm, José Luis Rojas Torrijos, Milan Angel Barbero, Thomas Horky, and Timo Shova. So we have 14 contributors from different parts of the world.
No, lo puedes entrar como panelista, claro, sí.
In our presentation, we will provide a reflection, first of all, on the concept of sports washing, and then we will delve into three main arguments or important aspects of the book. First of all, the prominence of the Middle East in sports washing discussions. Second, the nuanced boundaries between sports washing and sports development. And third, the role of sports washing in Western nations. Finally, we will hand over to three of our contributors who will provide insight into their specific chapters. So, first of all, we will delve into this concept, the central concept of sports washing. The term is new relatively, with the first uses in media that go back to 2015. This concept is complex, is multifaceted, and sometimes can be misunderstood. And in this volume, each of the authors provides an outline of what sports washing means and their characteristics. The explanation by Jules Boykov, professor at the Pacific University, Oregon, is often used, reflecting a more holistic approach to this sports washing term. Boykov highlights how sports washing is employed by political leaders who use sports to appear important or legitimate on the world stage, while stoking nationalism and deflecting attention from chronic social problems and human rights woes on the home front. Throughout these mega events, Boykov argues that sports washing tries to foment a national prestige and convey economic or political advancement. As we will see later, the practice is not only limited to authoritarian states, because also democratic political spaces are already employing extensively sports washing tactics. As Boykov highlights, Sports washing is a social relationship that entangles multiple audiences, both international and domestic, and sports washing can target a country's internal population as also the external global public. Sports washing can subtly massage reputational repair into public consciousness. As we mentioned, a first aspect that should be considered in this discussion is the prominence of the Middle East in these sports washing debates over the past decade. So we have seen, for instance, the celebration of the 22 FIFA Men's World Cup that was hosted in Qatar. More Formula One races have been scheduled throughout the region, and Saudi Arabia started the live golf tournament. Alongside this, key figures within this nation had also bought high-profile teams, including Qatar Sports Investment owning Paris Saint-Germain, the Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund controlling Newcastle United, and also we should consider the impact of the Saudi Arabia Vision 2030 that included a sports development plan and ambitions that was released in 2016, 10 years ago. This rise of sports washing through these mega events and competitions has often been seen by liberal nations as something to be condemned or as a curse on modern sport. For instance, critics contend that FIFA has ignored key elements to welcome the World Cup in different regions, such as in Qatar. To illustrate, in their chapter Lessons from Qatar, Christoph Seeger and Jorkuben Nieland highlight that in their coverage of the event, German media emphasized issues connected to labor exploitation, corruption, and LGBTQ discrimination. Along the same lines, Kristen Franzen, in her chapter Nordic Broadcasters in the Eye of the Storm, highlights that Danish public service broadcast media raised many critical elements around this tournament. Critical voices also complain that, for instance, a country like Saudi Arabia develops and promotes new events focusing on different markets. So in his chapter, Damien Storm notes that by hosting Formula One events, Saudi Arabia exposes itself to further global scrutiny pertaining to its human rights issues and the treatment of women, for instance. The creation of live golf has also been one of the greatest disruptors of global sport, with its tour backed by Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, creating anger, excitement, and also financial opportunities as well. As José Luis Rojas and Miguel Ángel Barbero write in their chapter A Sports Wash Agenda, the creation of live golf has also raised many issues for news media, for journalists, in terms of how this state-sponsored event should be covered and whether sport journalists should maintain the stick-to-sports traditional narrative when covering the event. Considering the designation, the planning, and the cancellation, finally, of the Olympic esports games in Saudi Arabia, Thomas Horky and Timo Schofler discuss also whether esport can be considered a form of game washing. I will now hand over to Peter.
Thank you, Xavier. So as we mentioned, the concept of sports washing is quite complicated. And what one country sees as sports washing, another sees as promotion. And we can see that, throughout the world, particularly how the West views the Middle Eastern countries, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, around some of those football issues and other sporting issues that we've seen. Now, one of the really interesting things is that Saudi Arabia is kind of walking away from its Vision 2030 project. So after contributing billions of dollars to help develop sport and business development and tourism in the nation, it's now moving forward to a different part, possibly the end of Live Golf. We wait and see if that gets further sponsorship, and perhaps a tilt. Sorry, they've already shown interest in hosting the Olympics in a couple of after Brisbane 2032. Xavier, the next slide, please. So in our book, Mohammed, who's doing a PhD looking at sports washing from a Saudi Arabia perspective, he provides an overview that we don't always see, especially from a liberal perspective. So he writes in his PhD and also in this chapter about how Saudi Arabia has developed and relied on sports to help their development. And this is particularly focused around the Vision 2030 aims. And throughout all of these different developments, it's sparked a global debate, at least in sport, over what is legitimate sports development, sponsorship, getting people to come to your country for major events versus sports washing, where they're trying to wash human rights abuses, poor treatment of various people, trying to paper over that or cover over that through their sport. Next slide, please, Xavier. So Saudi Arabia has used sport as an engine for economic diversification and internal transformation. And while our book has come out early in the year, of course, this has changed with their shift in focus away from spending, billions of dollars in sport to refocusing. And it's not just sport that the refocusing has happened. It's around their tourism and business strategies as well. So well, they had a multi-dimensional, sustained, and deeply embedded in broader national sport development goals. Their strategy has been developed and it will be redeveloped again. And we wait to see exactly what that means, but it's certainly created massive shifts globally for sport, particularly in football, also in golf and in motorsport. Next slide, please, Xavier. Now, can Western nations sports wash? It's a very easy accusation for Western nations to make of, what we, in inverted commas, see as a liberal nation. And our book starts with a really interesting chapter from David Rowe, who titles it Our Sports Diplomacy and Your Sports Washing. So what we see as sports diplomacy, the way that we are trying to develop sport to help around diplomatic elements, which we see around things, in the Olympics and India and Pakistan when they play cricket, and many other things that we'll continue to see over the next 2 months with the Football World Cup. But it highlights the hypocrisy of what the West can call sports washing or sports diplomacy. So Rowe argues that both liberal and illiberal nations have used sport for various political means. And I think, that's an impossible thing to argue against. Nations have used sport for many things. It's just whether we want to call it sports washing or diplomacy. But we particularly think in terms of, colonial histories of Western nations and elements that have been built that have certainly led to abuse. And now in a contemporary context, the West is very critical, particularly of the Middle East, in terms of their sports development. So Rowe, he looks at the UK, USA, Australia, New Zealand, and France, and examines whether these elements are sports washing or what we call more gently sports diplomacy. Now we're about to see a whole lot of sports washing at the World Cup, aren't we? So we've seen it already. I was watching some NBA last night where the president was at the NBA finals and may have been expecting a different reaction to all of the boos that he did receive in that. So world leaders, it's not unusual for world leaders to appear at these major events. And Jules Boykoff, he talks about the grin and grip photo opportunities with global power brokers and sports barons and a sporty halo effect. Now, sometimes, small example, but the basketball last night, sometimes that can go wrong, and other times it can really help legitimize organizations. So it will be interesting. Our book, of course, doesn't cover the upcoming World Cup, but it will be interesting to see how that goes. In terms of the US, sports washer, sports diplomacy, Boykoff writes that the US is in a once-in-a-generation opportunity to appear important on the world stage. So first there's the World Cup, and then in a couple of years there is the Olympics. And he argues that Trump is not likely to squander an opportunity to engage in sports washing. And it's quite interesting to see such a direct description of that in relation to a Western leader and not just someone from Saudi Arabia or Qatar. So Boykott's a cricketer. Boykoff is a researcher, predicts Trump would use the contest to self-aggrandize on the global stage while stoking nationalism and also deflect attention from domestic social problems. Next slide, please, Xavier. So locally, Los Angeles, host of the 2028 games, a younger photo there too of Donald Trump, Los Angeles has an epic humanitarian crisis around homelessness that Boykov says is unfolding in plain sight. So will the Olympics be able to wash that? I mean, we know through previous Olympics that homelessness is often an issue that is kind of pushed aside, literally, with the homeless people, and the event takes over and the sport takes over from these types of social issues. And they do this through distracting the public from unjust processes like gentrification. We can see that around London 2012, homelessness and hyper-policing. So lots of hot button social issues that get covered up when the sport comes and the economics and the power of the mega event arrives in town. Next slide, please, Xavier. And now we go back to Xavier. Thank you.
So thank you, Peter. So with these different chapters, with the different contributions, our aim is to help advance this understanding of sports washing as this complex issue with global and local implications. And we try to offer new perspectives and varied perspectives on this phenomenon and the mega events that connect with it. So it is our hope to, beyond this contribution, to make and to use this as a springboard for more detailed theoretical and empirical work. And we want contributors, but also other scholars, students, to continue exploring the nature, strategies, and tensions associated with sports washing practices across different countries and media systems. So it is our hope that our book stimulates and further motivates the discussion and academic reflection and research on the topic. And after this overview presentation, it is now our turn to listen from our authors. So we will hand over to three of our contributors who will provide insights into their specific chapters. And we will start with Alice Nemkova from the Czech Republic, Charles University, who will speak about sports washing in 5 Summer and Winter Olympic Games going back to Athens 2004. She will be followed by Luke Bird from the University of Auckland in New Zealand, who will provide insights on his chapter with Tony Bruce. So they have written about the Visit Saudi's planned partnership with the 2023 FIFA Women's World Cup, which was dropped after resistance by a coalition of players, coaches, politicians, and human rights organizations. So as Luke will explain, this case also illustrates that sports washing is not always effective. So criticism can make the country more visible for some of its negative practices. And finally, Christopher Chulok from Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona and Spain will offer us an overview of sports washing in the English Premier League, focusing on the influx of Middle Eastern owners and the injection of foreign state money into the UK. So we'll have 3 different perspectives, very interesting insights from the different contributors, and we would like to thank all of them for being here today and sharing this seminar with us. So I will stop sharing my screen and give the floor to Alice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xavi and Peter, for a very interesting intro to our perspectives. What I decided to start my presentation with before I will start sharing the screen, I'm going to speak about the sports washing of the Olympic and Paralympic Games. And I wanted to use the opportunity to show my husband's medals that are directly from the Olympic and Paralympic Games I'm going to speak about. This one is the bronze medal from the Beijing. And this one is the gold medal from the Athens. So I'm going to speak about those events, not always in the complementary way, but those were very great opportunities and events for our family. So now I will try to share my presentation, and I hope that I'm going to be successful with that. So now you should see my presentation. I hope that it will work for you. Do you see the full screen presentation, right? Okay, thank you very much. The name of my presentation is, and also the chapter is the Olympic Games for a Brighter Future or Not at All. And my approach to the sports washing in this chapter has been through the possible sports washing of the reputation of the countries and leaders who were organizing these events. I have selected several of them: Athens 2004, Beijing 2008 and 2022, and then Sochi 2014 and Rio de Janeiro 2016. All of them were international diplomatic successes in that time. Later, they were criticized quite a lot for the respective countries' leaders. And we can divide them into two possible clusters. The first one is Athens 2004 and Rio 2016 that were really meant to impress the world as the whole and to take the attention from the troubles the countries Greece and Brazil were facing in that time, and to present them as really interesting countries for all the world or worldwide. Both these events were quite criticized quite a lot for the troubles that were also tackling the homeless people, homelessness as the whole. It is something that I'm really interested in with the LA Olympic Games that are going to be organized in the US. So we can say also in the accordance with the previous speakers that it's going to be organized in the one of those leaders of the world, but they will face the very similar situation, and I am very interested in how they are going to tackle that. And then there is the second cluster, those organizers, China and Russia, that were focused more to persuade the domestic audience that their regimes are internationally respected and supported, while Greece and Brazil was more focused on the international reputation. These countries knew that they are not going to impress so much the international world. There were many demonstrations against all these events in many countries around the world, but they wanted to show their domestic audience that they are strong, and they connected a lot their success and success of their athletes with this kind of situation. What is interesting, and what I also have in my chapter in bigger detail, that the International Olympic Committee, under the leadership of the former president Thomas Bach, was unfortunately backpassing role of political neutrality, leading in the fact to the tolerance of human rights violence in exchange for the games successfully organized by the authoritarian states. And this was, of course, caused also by the economic costs of all these mega events that are organized. But we will see how it's going to be in the future, because we know how the situation is under the leadership of the new president of the IOC, who's from Zimbabwe, and who is also having some issues with, for example, the political gestures or the transgender people and their contribution in the Olympic and Paralympic Games. So we will see how it's going to develop. That's basically it for me, because I believe that I fulfilled my 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alice, for these really interesting insights on the relationship between sports washing and the Olympics and the Olympic movement. Now it's the turn for Luke Bird, who will give us the insight from his chapter with Tony Bruce. Thanks, Luke.
Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Kia everyone. I'm Luke. I'm here at the University of Auckland, trying my best to stay awake. It's very late here. So yeah, we were interested in there's this view that sports washing is bad, right? And we were particularly interested in, okay, so what are the conditions under which sports washing can be successfully resisted? And in 2023, news broke in The Athletic that Visit Saudi, the tourism arm of the state of Saudi Arabia, was to be the main sponsor of the Women's World Cup held here in New Zealand and Australia. And there was a huge backlash to this. Most of the media discourse around this was centered on the concept of sports washing. There seemed to be a huge disconnect between a history of gender and sexuality-based repression in Saudi Arabia, and on the other hand, one of the biggest celebrations of women's sport. And after about 6 weeks of silence from FIFA, they announced that they'd withdrawn the sponsorship. Infantino cynically referred to this backlash as a storm in a teacup, and we were interested in, okay, what were the conditions under which sports washing was resisted in this case? So we turned to news media to try and understand what was going on here. And three major themes emerged. So as part of I'm a PhD student and I look at sports washing and how it's covered in the media. And I've read thousands of news articles, and human rights groups are incredibly prominent in the coverage of this. They're massively adept at becoming quoted in news articles about sports washing. And what they're very good at is calling attention to specific laws, policies, cultural norms, values within these certain states that they deem as at odds with the values of more Western sport. And coverage repeatedly highlighted what Frew and colleagues would call widespread sustained moral violations like mistreatment of women and LGBTQI communities. What was quite interesting about lots of the coverage was that criticism extended beyond Saudi Arabia to FIFA, the governing body's complicity in this. And what was quite interesting is that of the 184 articles that we analysed, not one spoke of Saudi Arabia positively. So we argue that rather than distracting attention from human rights issues, this sponsorship, this kind of attempt at sports washing, as it were, had the opposite effect. It intensified scrutiny of them. A second interesting factor was that there was a level of political and organizational opposition to it, particularly here in the host nations. So day one, both football associations publicly denounced the sponsorship as inappropriate. Senior politicians from both host nations reinforced this opposition through public statements, and it later emerged that they'd been lobbying FIFA behind the scenes. At the sporting level, football associations, players' unions, governing bodies largely presented a united front on this. Players were encouraged to boycott the tournament or protest as they deemed appropriate. And we argue this is important because in lots of previous examples of sports washing, there've been quite a few famous cases where influential political actors facilitated the sports washing investment, as it were, rather than opposing it. One of the key things that we thought was probably most impactful in this opposition was the level to which very prominent athletes spoke out about it. So some of the most famous players in the world came out and essentially put their foot down and said, we're not having this. This is completely at odds with the values promoted within women's football. Alex Morgan of the US, after a couple of weeks, spoke to the US media about it, and it created huge spikes in coverage worldwide. And following that, lots of other athletes started speaking out about it. And what was quite interesting about the way that they were speaking to the press was they were speaking from their own lived experience, either as female athletes or as queer athletes, and really pressuring FIFA to do the right thing and reverse their decision. And we argue that this contrasts pretty sharply with the relative silence, or some people see it as cooperation of their male counterparts in other sports washing controversies. Okay, so what can we learn from this? That resisting sports washing is perhaps strongest when multiple stakeholders act together. And we're not trying to imply that they were working together on this, just that there were kind of multiple forces approaching this issue from different angles. Athletes displayed quite a strong level of agency and been able to influence the governing bodies. Rather than distracting from human rights issues, the opposite occurred. And lots of the sports washing literature talks about how investments in sports serve to promote a state's soft power assets. And we kind of found that the reverse was true. What Brannigan and Giulianotti would call soft disempowerment. And it was also pretty interesting the way that not only was the opposition leveled at Saudi Arabia as a state, but also the governing body FIFA. And ultimately in the chapter we argue that sports washing isn't inevitable, money doesn't always talk, and under certain conditions it can be effectively resisted.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Luke, for these insights and also these takeaways from the case study with the Visit Saudi's partnership and how it was resisted by these different stakeholders. And now it's the turn for Chris Tulloch, who will share his insights on the English Premier League. I don't know, Chris, if you want me to share the PowerPoint.
Can you see?
Yeah.
You can see that?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Okay, well, good morning, good evening, good night to everyone joining the seminar. It's obviously it's impossible to compete with Alice with her medal presentation, so we better move on. Yeah, so what I decided to do was to look at the sports washing phenomenon in the Premier League. Let me see if I can move this on myself, because although you can, right, the screen has just changed, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, what I'm basically looking at is the sports washing phenomenon in the English Premier League, which we know takes place through various formulas. You know, one could be direct ownership, sponsorship deals, and over recent years, well, it's just become an integral part of the Premier League's DNA. What I was quite interested in is the sort of hangover from 2021, the post Newcastle United takeover by the Pith Fund in Saudi Arabia. And this sort of led me just to take a look back over the last 20 years of the Premier League and to sort of dive into these quite complex sports washing debates. Yeah, as you can all imagine, the system is fairly simple. This is kind of explained in the chapter. I'm most interested in the final part, actually, about how the success of a team, which may be based on Gulf state finance, for example, in this particular case of Newcastle or Manchester City, compromises the fans' moral and ethical stance. It's a very interesting sort of sociological phenomenon. So this was one of the inspirational articles for the chapter by John Wilson in The Guardian. And it's quite clear why the Premier League is such an attractive product, right? Obviously the world's most popular sport and so many nationalities. And I think it's very interesting, 70% of players in the Premier League are foreign, which immediately gives it this global capacity for publicity. So it is really one of the most attractive products in the store. So as we know, up until now, it's worked on sort of like triple level. Products have been created, such as the Saudi League. Then, of course, there's the hosting of European tournaments like the Supercoppa d'Italia or the Supercoppa of Spain. And then, of course, there's, naming rights and ownership and, of course, shirt sponsorship. So when we look back, it's interesting to remember all the different combinations here. Of course, we had Abramovich, who was, running Chelsea for 20 years. His assets are now, of course, frozen after the Russia-Ukrainian conflict. Arsenal has just renewed its deal with Rwanda. Rwanda, of course, is in armed conflict with the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And it's quite interesting. The CEO of Arsenal talked about another possibility to share our enduring values, which I thought was an interesting, to put it mildly, PR statement. Then, of course, there's City and its relationship to the Abu Dhabi group. There's one that's always overlooked, which was Saudi Arabia's involvement in Sheffield United, because at that time, Sheffield United were between the Championship and the Premier. They were going up and down. So that's an interesting case of a takeover at a slightly lower level club. And then, of course, it really came to prominence and crystallized the whole debate when the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia moved into St. James's Park. So trying to find reasons for why this has kind of consolidated itself, and without falling into the trap of what Crossley and Wolfe very well called the spontaneous sociology of sports washing, which I think is a great phrase. First of all, I'm really interested in this sort of renegotiation of the concept of fandom. Just by going on social media posts, we can see how Manchester City and Newcastle and Arsenal fans will behave as these foot soldiers, right? Even though they may be placed into sort of moral cul-de-sac, club loyalty always seems to win. They are, of course, much more spectacular for the media when we see these kinds of images. This was very controversial at the moment, and even Newcastle United actually had to put out a press statement asking the fans not to dress this way. But these are very juicy, mediatic material, these kinds of photos, whereas photos of opposition groups are much less spicy in that sense. These statistics are quite interesting. These come from Statista. This was taken in 2021 when only 20% of the fans said that their club should be taken over by PIF. And then 1 year later, over 95% of them were very satisfied with the club's ownership. So fans' allegiances turn around very, very quickly. There's little mainstream media space for talking about the moral contradictions of this. I mean, beyond, obviously, in specialized publications, we can read about this, but in mainstream media, most popular divulgative media, it's not. Their players and pundits suffer with this, so they're on this stick to the football mode. And then, of course, there's professional media training. And this took me to Qatar 2022, when there's an interesting study about how often the phrase shine a light was repeated by Jordan Henderson, Harry Kane, John Stones, etc. So even the media, the players themselves are like prepped to develop a discourse which is basically vague and to avoid treading on these subjects. So you can see how these defensive prepping in many ways aids sports washing, Eddie Howe being a particularly complex example. The former Bournemouth manager being thrown in to give his opinion on public executions in Saudi Arabia, which probably went beyond his job remit when he took the job. Sports washers are basically block out dissonance. There's the triumph of this let's not bring politics into football discourse. There is, of course, opposition. Newcastle United have their own oppositional fan club base, but they are pretty much pushed out off the radio by the media. An interesting idea is the simultaneous ownership. So, as you know, the City Group have 10 or 11 teams all around the world. Many of them have the same acronym. They're MCFC. This is interesting because it allows this a sort of association to really push out, leak into other global markets. And what was particularly interesting about Luke's article on how the 2023 Women's World Cup was resisted was, of course, how in the case of the UK, it was exactly the opposite. And we do have access to the mails of Boris Johnson, openly pressurizing for Saudi Arabian investments, and a local council being forced to digest the message that this will be beneficial to their community. So it's exactly the opposite case. just one final thing. There's this interesting idea that sports washed clubs, if we like to put it that way, are better run. This is an interesting development, that there's savvy management. In other words, they're very wealthy because they know how to do things in a very sort of crude manner. And we can see this at the city level and Arsenal scouting and youth development and so on. There's a whole discourse around the financial restraint. These people, PIF could have brought all this money to football and they've actually held back. Whereas if you actually look at the team that won their first trophy in 70 years, they were all paid for with Saudi Arabian money. So this is a sort of sub-layer of media discourse. Now, on the other side, which is David Rowe's article is, your sports diplomacy against sports washing comes in here. And there is this idea that there is a sort of constructed exceptionalism. In other words, many sports washers get away with it. A good example is Manchester United, of course. Ineos is very infrequently labeled as a multinational plastics company. And not only that, but Sir Jim is, of course, presented as a local lad, right, with Mancunian roots. So he's our sports washer, not yours. And then, of course, there's cases like, AEA at Sports and Standard Charters at Liverpool who really invest in fossil fuels. There's the discourse about the colonialist biased, which is out there in the literature, that this is only used negatively to state actors who are outside the West, which is something that David also reiterates, and the tolerance of other practitioners who you may not immediately think of sports washing, but certainly wash their dirty laundry in public, such as the case of gambling companies who we were told were being pushed out of the game, but are still around. And there's this whole debate about whether the gambling companies go on the front of their shirts or on the side. At the moment, they're going to be on the side of their shirts. And so finally, Boykov also does mention that this is a calculated gamble. So by getting involved in these Premier League clubs, they are subject to greater scrutiny, which may open up the can of worms, which they've been trying to put the lid on. But the gamble is taken, and at the moment, it's consolidating itself. There's fairly limited popular opposition to these operations now. It's sort of eventually, through osmosis, got through. And of course, the big thing is that they can take advantage of this cul-de-sac in which we find ourselves, particularly sports fans, which is, do you abandon your team or do you allow this, what could be seen as reputational damage, to come through the side door, as Boykov mentions, but you will allow that if your team is successful on the field. So there's this sort of, just to finish, this sort of cognitive storage, sort of refrigeration of our moral compass when we're faced with these sports washing nations or practitioners who come briefly over and, as Boykov himself mentioned, take over our de facto ambassadors for their campaigns. So that's all from me. And just one final thing, just to say thanks to Xavi and Peter and to Xavier Ginesta for allowing us to meet online and to talk out the issues that are in the book. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris, Alice, and Luke, for sharing your ideas and the arguments advanced by your chapters. So now we hand over to our host, Xavier Ginesta, for the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Xavier, and all of the panelists. I think that your presentations were very interesting and give to us a lot of insights to develop more research in the field of sports washing, which I think it's going to be needed, at least after the World Championship in America. I want to start the Q&A with a question regarding methodology, because this is also a seminar for PhD students at the University of Vic, Central University of Catalonia. And I want to ask you, for the PhD students that are enrolling this seminar, above all, Xavier and Peter, if you have to summarize a little bit, what are the main methodological tools that you use to analyze sport washing practices? How you could summarize these methodological tools? Were mainly qualitative? Were mainly quantitative? What your book? What type of methodologies cover?
Thank you for that question. There are a range of qualitative approaches. Luke would be good to talk about this because one of his chapter was kind of the most in depth in terms of the rigor across how many newspaper articles that he looked at. I think it was more than 180. Some of them were quite descriptive in looking at different issues. Chris is one of that. Lots and lots of different research, but more in what I would describe as a case study style. There wasn't a whole lot of quantitative research done in this book, mostly because we were describing the field. It's an early stage book or early stage work, and we expect that some quantitative elements will come next because as we said, it's a contested space where some people argue that sports washing isn't even a thing. So mostly it was qualitative analysis. I'm happy for Luke to chip in there and Xavier as well. Thank you.
Xavier?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, do you want to go first, Xavier?
No, look.
No, Luke, you can go on and I will add some things. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So my wider PhD, I'm doing a news framing analysis of the concept of sports washing itself. And I've kind of applied some of those principles to this case study. Yeah, it was largely content analysis. It was myself and Tony sitting down over a few sessions of coding to try and understand what was going on here. I think one of the biggest challenges is that FIFA itself as an organization over the years, and since Infantino has come into power, it's almost impossible to get any information out of FIFA. They've even cancelled kind of scheduled press conferences. So it was very difficult to get any information on the reasoning behind the decision to bring Visit Saudi on as a sponsor or the decision to withdraw it. So we turned to the way that international news media were reporting on it to try and understand what exactly had gone on here. So yeah, we used the Factiva database using search terms. I think initially it was about 500 news articles, and then we screened that for relevance. Quite a lot of them just merely involved hyperlinks to related content. And then yeah, we just coded it for themes and had lots of different conversations about what we thought was going on. But it was kind of international focus. There was lots of different news outlets, predominantly Australia and New Zealand, but the US, the UK, mostly kind of liberal Western news media were the ones reporting on this. So that was what we analysed.
There's another interesting idea here, complementing to Peter and Luke's insights, is that we have some chapters also incorporating further qualitative analysis in terms of text. So qualitative content analysis and textual analysis of, for instance, traditional media. So for instance, how Danish public service media covered the Qatar 2022 World Cup. So in the case of Christoph and Jörg Nieland, we had an interesting qualitative study comparing Qatari and German press. So it was interesting to understand how both media outlets from these different two territories compared. And it was a methodological challenge in itself to try to make sense of the narratives and the different arguments and counter arguments in two different media contexts that are very different among themselves. And also it was interesting, and you will see that in the chapter written by José Luis Rojas and Miguel Ángel Barbero, which they went through a different qualitative route, which was the in-depth interviews, in this case with six journalists working in leading media who covered the Live Golf tournament. So they interviewed professionals working in the Spanish public broadcaster, Radio Televisión Española, El País, leading radio stations like COPE, also leading newspapers, written and online newspapers like Marca, and they developed these interviews very intensively over a couple of months at the end of 2024. So it's really interesting how these different qualitative methods are applied to understand sports washing from different perspectives. And also we have some chapters that are more theoretically based, but still they provide a good background and a good laying ground for developing empirical studies from here.
Thank you very much, Xavier. There's another question from Nahuel Faido. The question says, based on the examples you discuss, do you think sports washing is now more effective and influencing? One moment, please. Sorry. Do you think that sports washing is more effective and influencing domestic audiences than improving a country's international image and reputation? And do you think this trend will continue in the forthcoming years?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question that's aimed on me. I've got the feeling that it's kind of the mixture, because some countries need to strengthen their domestic reputation, and some countries really need to boost their international image. And we can see that what I am particularly interested now, because also the work on, and it's slightly connected to the previous question about methodology, I was so happy to participate in the book in the manner that could put together my journalistic and academic experience, because witnessing something firsthand was really important for me to go through. Then not only since in the last decade I'm doing all the analysis, communication and sports communication analysis, and it was refreshing to approach it slightly differently. In this case, I am also following, just out of my interest, the communication of Saudi investments funds and their very good strategic communication towards the female sport and women's sport. And it is something they are connected a lot with the women tennis. And it is extremely interesting how they are supporting things that you cannot oppose anyhow, like the maternity leave or stuff like that. And they are slightly going to be acknowledged without any difficulties, and to get the firm ground under their feet, to go simply further and further, because they realized that it's not enough just to sponsor big clubs, mega events and everything, because then you are going to be opposed for various things. But when you are approaching those social affairs, social issues, even there are only the biggest international outlets that dare to question the money and the situation, for example, the social security, and also the human rights in Saudi Arabia, for example, for women and their possibilities to do the sports there. And it is something that's really interesting, and that I would be following in the future, because it is the new way, I would say, how to approach these topics and how to sports wash your reputation much nicely than when you are simply going to support the big events.
Thank you very much. There is a comment of Professor Boyle saying congratulations for the book, looking forward for reading it. And he likes a lot this idea that sports washing is transmitted, but it's not always what is received. I don't know if you want to do a comment on this. And then there is a question of Thomas Harkey. Professor Harkey says, can you take a look into a future of sport washing, please? Will the situation with the World Cup 2034 in Saudi Arabia change? Maybe me as a Western nation will take another view on sports then.
Thank you, Thomas, for your question and also your chapter on esports. It was interesting how quickly that Saudi Arabia's view on esports changed, where for years they were looking at the esports Olympics and then suddenly it had dropped. So the strategy changed. We see that too through the Vision 2030 with them now focusing on mega events rather than lots and lots of quite big events. Can we see into the future? Well, what we can do is look to the past. There's already been the World Cup in Qatar, and Germany was very good at protesting that. Does that mean Saudi Arabia will have an easier ride when it is their turn to host, or will there be more pressure? I can't guess, but maybe it means that fewer people watch the soccer and more people turn to field hockey. Thomas is a very good field hockey player. So we are allowed to choose the sports that we like or dislike. I hope that lots of people are talking about these kinds of issues with the Football World Cup in the next couple of months, because there are so many similarities in terms of the political influence and the national level influence. So maybe this is the norm when these types of nations, no matter where they are in the world, is happening. And maybe we'll see something different at the 2032 Olympics and Paralympics in Brisbane, because Australia is just a small place, a regional Olympics. Maybe there'll be a different outlook there. But still, even at smaller, in terms of scales, Australia has human rights issues as well, that I'm sure that there will be accusations of some of these things being washed. Thanks for your question, Thomas.
Thank you very much.
Can I add something there, Xavi?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Just about just going back to now World's question. I think, for example, in the case study that I did on the Premier League, I think it's pretty clear that sports washing is now more effective at influencing domestic audiences. Absolutely, no doubt on that one. And as for Thomas's question, yeah, the future of sports washing. Well, yeah, I think we do tend to talk about sports washing as if it's, a sort of fairly contemporary phenomenon when we know it's not. But, this has been going on for many, many decades. Of course, the most famous example being Berlin 36. So this is a sort of, by the time we get to Saudi Arabia, it'll be almost 100 years of Olympic Games with where you could point out elements of sports washing in almost all of them, including boycotts and so on. So I think there is certainly a movement to not want to host some of these mega events. And I think, as Alice points out in her chapter, that 6 of the 8 bids pulled out, particularly things like, the Winter Olympic Games. I think it's very ironic that in her chapter, she talks about, the problems of climate change and how some of these countries may actually save the games in that sense. It's just a kind of interesting perspective. So, the future is the present. And just to go back what Peter mentioned, I think there's also wider questions that we should throw in the mix as well about sort of global North media dynamics versus global South media dynamics as well. Some countries undoubtedly, if you like, get a good press. I mean, I could tell you right now that 2032, according to the Western press in Brisbane, will be probably, framed as a success. We can almost anticipate these dynamics. So, an interesting study here is how global South media view those hosts of mega sporting events and their performance and how they've done it in comparison to our own sort of Western, as Thomas mentions, a sort of Western nation perspective. So not to sort of necessarily associate our Western global North perspective on the performance of these sports washing hosted events, and not necessarily associate that with a sort of universal perspective. Other countries view things differently, as we all know.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I am David, Chris, sorry. So thank you very much. It's 1 o'clock, so it's fantastic because these webinars should last 1 hour. Thank you very much for your perspectives, your insights. I totally agree with you that we have to start thinking about how we conceptualize the sport washing in relation to the different perspectives, considering the global north and the global south. I think that this is one of the most important challenges we have in terms of the academy and most of all the universities that we are in the global north. So I think that we have a lot of challenges. We have a lot of work to do. And thank you very much for this fantastic webinar. Thank you very much on behalf of the PhD program on communication and design at the University of Vic Central University of Catalonia. And thank you very much also on behalf of the Spring Network, which is also a network that always welcome you to join. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.